So today, as Holly mentioned, my topic is clothing the Son of Heaven, the Emperor's robe. Now, Chinese robes have been collected, heavily collected. They appear in many museums and also private collections. And it's not surprising. These are spectacular garments. They represent extremely high virtuosity in weaving and embroidery. But of course, there's much more to them than that, and there are many books that have been written about imperial wardrobe. So obviously this talk is just going to give you a little primer to introduce you to the idea of the emperor's robe, some of its symbolism, some of its history, how we got there. So we know that traditional garments in general, give us information about people's lifestyle, about social and cultural values, kinship relationships and other kinds of relationships, roles, including political roles, and also technical developments of a people. And these robes that we're going to be talking about today certainly will give us information about all these things. For this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the last dynasty of China, the Qing dynasty, which lasted from 1644 until 1911. Dragon robes had been used in, whoops, did I just lose some sound? Or am we okay? Okay. Dragon robes had been used in China since maybe the 7th century, but really it was around the 18th century that it became a very consistent program of symbolism and design. One of the interesting things about the Manchu, who were the Qing rulers, is that they were not Chinese. This was a foreign conqueror who ruled China for well over 200 years. And as such, the robes that they wore are a very interesting example or a statement of both resistance to cultural assimilation as well as cultural fusion. So I hope today you'll be able to see some of that and understand it. So here are a couple of emperors. This is Emperor Kangxi, who was the second emperor of the Qing, a very brilliant statesman. And this is his son, the Emperor Yongzhen. But first I want to clarify what I mean by the term Son of Heaven. The emperor in China was not divine, but was divinely appointed by heaven to rule on its behalf. And there was a concept called the mandate of heaven, which really developed very, very early in China, maybe as early as the 11th century BC. So the idea of the mandate of heaven is that the emperor's power, which in many ways was absolute, but it was not absolute under heaven. The emperor was expected to rule as a benevolent sage king, have wisdom, and really act on behalf of his people. So there were basic expectations, political expectations of moral behavior, of what's called propriety. And his behavior was all part of the cosmic order. He was an integral part of the cosmic order. And he was the sole link between heaven and earth. So his right to rule was contingent on mediating these cosmic forces. And the repercussions of improper behavior could cause him to lose the mandate of heaven. Now, this was usually signified by great natural disasters. Things were obviously going wrong. Heaven was not happy. And when this happened, the people were actually entitled to revolt. In fact, this was a definite sign that he had lost the mandate of heaven, was if his people were actually rebelling against him. So if things went wrong, he was responsible and he could be overthrown. And then the new people who came in, they could claim the mandate of heaven. But of course, they had to prove that they had the mandate of heaven by, again, doing the proper rituals, being benevolent, being a sage king. When the Qing came into power, even though they were not Chinese, in order to claim the mandate of heaven, they had to assert the legitimacy of the system of the mandate of heaven and conform to it in order to be legitimate in the eyes of the people. And here we have a very small minority ruling a very great majority of Chinese. Now, in these two images, we see two types of robes. This first one is a chaofu and is really a robe of state. It is the highest regalia, the most ceremonial of all the garments. So this is akin to Queen Elizabeth in her robes of state with her crown, orb, and scepter. This particular type of robe was used for only the highest ceremonies, and only the members of the imperial family and the highest officials in the land were entitled to wear this style of robe. This robe that Emperor Yongzheng wears is a jifu. It's considered semi-formal. Now, when you see these in person, it's hard to conceive of them as semi-formal because they're silk, often silk satin, heavily embroidered or woven with gold thread, hardly what we'd consider, cocktail wear. But this is probably what we are most familiar with in terms of a dragon robe. And it's an interesting garment in that all the members of the civil bureaucracy wore a variation of this robe. Of course, the emperor's was set apart. It was different. It had special symbolism. But there was uniformity as well as specialness for the emperor. So here we see these robes kind of flattened out for you. So rich symbolism in this garment. And really, as I've said, it was the most recognizable costume worn by those that served the court as well as the rulers. The shape is based on traditional Manchu garments. Now, the Manchu were a semi-nomadic people. They lived in the north. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But they were horse culture. Consequently, their robes were fitted fairly snugly, and also the north of China is cold, so they needed to have them tightly fastened to conserve warmth. They were also known as very impressive warriors as well as horsemen, so we have slits to accommodate sitting on a horse, narrow sleeves which didn't interfere with drawing a bow. These were also, they're not generally shown belted, but they were also always worn with a snug belt to, again, further keep them close to the body. And then from the belt, you could hang various accessories and tools, such as purses and a dagger, some flints. So while, as I've mentioned, the chaofu was worn for the highest rituals, the jifu, as well as at other times, was worn for the 3 days of fasting and purification rites that preceded the ritual. So they went together. Now, one of the ways that these robes were distinguished from ordinary people was that only the emperor could wear bright yellow, and only members of the imperial family could wear tones of yellow. You probably are aware of this. But yellow tones ranged everything from bright yellow through to brown and even into a plummy brown. So often when we see robes in museums, it might be identified as imperial, but not necessarily be yellow. This yellow color was really had been associated with the emperor for a long, long time, right back to the legendary Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, who was considered to sort of be a founder of China in, well, mythological times, really. So here we have a description of a dragon having the head of a camel, the horns of a deer, eyes of a rabbit, don't quite understand that one, the ears of a cow, the neck of a snake, belly of a frog, scales of a carp, claws of a hawk, and the footpads of a tiger. This description dates from the Han Dynasty, which is about 206 BC to 220 AD. And in Chinese tradition, there were actually many kinds of dragons, but the depiction of dragons pretty much followed this formula, and they're really quite recognizable. Now, you may know also that one of the ways the emperor was distinguished was by the number of claws on the dragon, 5 being reserved for the imperial family, 4 for officials. This held true into the 19th century when people started to play a little fast and loose with that, but generally this was one of the distinguishing marks of the tiger. So dragons appear very early in Chinese art. Here's an example from the Zhou dynasty, 4th to the 3rd century BC. And they are present even earlier than that. But here I think you can see the relationship of shape between these jade dragons and the one on the robe. It is the most powerful of China's mythological animals. It is generally associated with rain, with water, more broadly with rain. So obviously we have lots of dragons in Vancouver. It's seen as benevolent and a good omen, maybe in contrast to Western notions of European dragons. And, however, it's also very much associated with strength and power. And it symbolized imperial power in China for over 1,500 years. And as I think I mentioned, in use for robes from at least the 7th century. By the 12th century, it was very specifically associated with the imperial court, and most specifically with the emperor. So if you like, the dragon became a logo for not only the emperor, but also the imperial throne, and more broadly, all of China. So, I know this is small, just hang on, we'll get to a couple of details. One of the most important things of the emperor was his ritual and sacral robe. In China, there was really no separation between church and state. And religion in China is a whole other discussion that requires probably an entire class. But in any case, in terms of official religion, the emperor was the chief priest, the supreme priest. Now, this really is just a macro level of patriarchs performing rituals to the ancestors and the family, village elders performing these same rituals, and maybe to the bigger forces on behalf of the village, and so on right up to the emperor. He was performing ritual on behalf of the entire empire, and these were designed to maintain peace and order and keep heaven happy, most importantly. So they were vital for the well-being of the entire entire empire, and the emperor had to spend a fair bit of his time performing these because they happened at many times of the year, and there were many different kinds of ritual. These included worship of elemental forces and gods of soil and grain, agriculture, the emperor's own ancestors, Confucius. Many things were part of this whole system of ritual. So, ensured peace, averted disaster, kept things going well. Proper attire was really critical to maintaining this proper hierarchical order, and also, I think, to signify to heaven what was going on. So here, on the far left of the painting, we see the altar. This is the altar of agriculture, prepared for the emperor. We see ranks of civil officials standing in their blue surcoats, which have the rank badges on, rank badges on them. And then those are attendants all in red. And then coming along the path, we have another group including some military honor guard, if you like, more civil officials coming. And finally, right there, this is the guy it's all about, the emperor. And you can see a little bit of his yellow robe under his surcoat there. So, interestingly, in China now, there are recreations of some of these rituals. So the theatrical quality of state ritual, imperial ritual, has now become an actual performance. And it really begs the question, what is the purpose of these? I don't know the answer, but is it a way to recapture this kind of glorious heritage of the imperial time, which certainly was glorious in its art and culture, maybe not so glorious for people who weren't at the top of the heap? Is it just a spectacle for tourists? I don't know. We do know that traditional clothing can assume new significance in certain situations, and that cultural nationalism can be an avenue for political nationalism. I don't know if that's what's going on here. Certainly, Chinese people now are free to explore a lot of the history of their dynastic period. There was a long time when this was simply not acceptable. And Chinese tourism, domestic Chinese tourism, is huge. Another interesting thing about this is that in imperial times, the rituals were not public spectacles. No one was there that wasn't part of the ritual. But the people did know what was going on, and they held it in awe because they understood its importance for everyone in the empire. The other thing is that such rituals were typically started well before dawn, so in the dark, not in bright sun like this, but it helps us to think about the way, the appearance of these rituals with all the gold, embroidery, the shiny silk, in flickering torchlight. And I often think that First Nations people that do button blanket dancing, that is one of the things there. Typically it would have been lit with just flickering firelight or torchlight, and it gives a completely different quality to the experience. And here again we see the people playing the parts of imperial civic officials with their blue surcoats over top of their dragon robes. Now, we also know that clothing has social significance, relates individuals to one another, reflects social structures, roles, rank, wealth, of course, and also ethnicity. I have to remember that China, for a long, long time, was the big cheese in Asia. It was the dominant power, and it was the center of civilization. Its culture was highly admired, not just by other Asian nations, but much further afield. Silk, Chinese silk, was heavily coveted, and the robes, as an extension of that, as sort of the epitome of craftsmanship, were also heavily coveted. From very early times, China made gifts of silk and robes in exchange, in a sense, or to recognize the tribute paid to them by various nations that surrounded them, that wanted to be associated with the Chinese court in some way, have diplomatic relations, trade, some kind of relationship. So here, this gifting of robes is a way of marking a relationship. From the Chinese side, it's basically marking those who belonged to China in one way or another. These robes are also sometimes used as bribery to cut down cross-border raiding along the north, especially, and sometimes used to divide groups. Divide and conquer. One group got robes, the other one didn't. Now, many of these robes were adapted by the people who received them to reflect their own traditions. So here we have a Tibetan coat that's obviously been restyled from a dragon robe, but the opening has been changed, the cuffs have been removed. It's now a Tibetan robe. Here, This is actually the Yongzheng emperor again, but a painting of him kind of taking on the persona of a Mongol Khan wearing a Mongol version of a dragon robe. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, close neighbors weren't the only ones who had a fascination with Chinese robes. So here we see a very beautiful coat and waistcoat, again, fashioned out of a dragon robe. So again, remaking it into their own style of clothing. And here is a photograph, 19th century photograph of a model wearing, in this case, a woman's robe. We have to think about the context, though, of these kinds of use. Just as, there's a meaning from the Chinese standpoint, giving a robe to another culture remaking that robe. Here we also have some questions, which I'll just raise, but not try to answer necessarily. In the 18th century, foreigners started to visit China much more than they ever had before. And of course, they collected stuff, including robes, and robes were often given to foreigners as a mark of respect. But then there was also starting to be some societal upheaval later, which meant that people sold off their personal treasures, possibly including robes. And then even later into the 19th century, there was wartime pillaging of imperial sites by Europeans. Here in the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, China was highly respected, highly admired for its orderly society, its peaceful empire. And so maybe this splendid coat sort of speaks to the desire to associate with this high culture, this high esteem for China. But during the 19th century, when the photograph was made, by now there's industrialization going on in Europe. China is seen as backwards. It's seen as stuck in the past. And even seen with disdain. So we have to wonder what kind of message is behind this photograph, if any. Is it speak to colonial attitudes of conquest, or the exotic, mysterious other of the East? It's just times change and meanings change. Here's a detail of this fabulous coat. So this is still going on. Foreigners still find Chinese robes pretty fascinating. You too can be emperor for at least 5 minutes. And again, is this an experienced desire to somehow experience the magnificence of the Chinese court? Is it just fancy dress? Is it just a lark when you're in China in the Forbidden City? I mean, I doubt that these funny tourists, no offense, really thought about the bigger implications of what they were doing. And certainly as Westerners, we have a fascination with imperial pageantry. In North America, we don't really see it in the same way as like a royal wedding. And we know the royal wedding, a lot of that's about the clothes, right? So here's the clothes. And speaking of the clothes, definitely, the clothes inspire artists and designers right to today. And we know that one of the things that the dragon robe itself communicated was wealth, privilege, rank, status, certainly opulence, the opulence of the court. It's glamorous and exotic. Maybe to us as Westerners, it's exotic Orientalism. But dressing to impress, this is important. And as I mentioned, traditionally the highest quality and specific designs were associated with the hierarchy of the court. And as we know, ceremonial occasions still call for the finest clothing to create a dazzling display. You only have to go to a wedding these days to know that. But ultimately, power and relationships are revealed in dress and uniforms and costume. The emperor was the head of state. He was also the commander-in-chief of the army. And so in him is centralized political authority and also military control. Thus, the dragon robe is fundamentally associated with political power today, obviously, as much as in the 17th century. And here, the artist has substituted other kinds of symbols of China's power that are as easily read by us today as the symbols on a dragon robe would have been in the 17th to 19th, 20th century. Okay, so let's shift to a little bit of history. Quick, just brief. I mean, China's got a lot of history, so it's hard, but. So we're just gonna go to the Song dynasty, which lasted from about 960 to 1279 in different forms. During the Song, there were pressures, ongoing pressures from the people to the north. Now, this was not new. From very early times, China struggled with northern nomadic peoples, semi-nomadic peoples. You might have heard of the Great Wall. One of the reasons it was built was to try to keep these people out. I have to say it wasn't very effective. It's impressive, but it's wasn't very effective. So in this case, the Liao there to the north, they were a very strong cultural group. But they weren't strong enough to overcome China. The presence of the Liao really bugged China, but they weren't strong enough to overcome the Liao. So they achieved this balance of power. They had diplomatic relationships. They grudgingly tolerated each other. They even had this sort of pseudo big brother, little brother relationship. But it wasn't that comfortable. Finally, the last emperor of the northern Song, tellingly the last emperor, decided he'd had enough, and he asked the Jin, the Jurchen Jin, who were to the northeast, to help him get rid of the Liao, push them out. So the Jurchen Jin did so, shifted the Liao to the further west, but then sometime later, the Jurchen Jin thought, well, we're here, we know you're militarily weak, we're staying. So they pushed the Chinese court south, which created the southern Song dynasty. And the Jurchens established their own dynasty, the Jin dynasty. So this is one example where foreigners controlled part of China. What were they wearing in the Song dynasty? Well, voluminous Chinese robes. These date back many centuries, right back to the Han dynasty, 200 BC to 200 AD, where, great importance and value was attributed to wearing silk, and the more the better. So lots of silk, lots of just volume of silk. This is the kind of garment that reflects what we call loom-shaped clothing, where you're using the full width of the cloth as it comes off the loom and trying not to waste any of it. Because if you've ever woven or bought something hand-woven, it's laborious, especially when you're starting from raising the silkworm, spinning the silk, weaving the silk, dyeing the silk, embroidering the silk. I mean, it's valuable. So you don't cut it up. Now, bulk is always associated with power, with inspiring awe. It's impressive, not just in China. So here we see Napoleon, obviously wearing very fine fabric, fur, his state implements. He's impressive. But we want to contrast this garment with what the nomadic people were wearing. Now, again, they're horse cultures, They're outdoors, very active kind of lifestyle. This particular painting was a painting from the Song Dynasty. The story actually relates to earlier people, but it's felt that the depiction was based on Liao culture, because that's what people in the Song Dynasty were familiar with. So we see, again, the tight sleeves, the close-fitting robes, slits to allow horseback riding. I don't know if you remember the map, but further to the west was a group called the Xia, the Xixia to the west. So this is a painting from about the same time period of the emperor of the Xixia, and this is pretty much one of the earliest surviving representations of a dragon robe with roundels that contain a dragon. And here is a Liao robe, which also has dragon roundels. And the Liao robe is the oldest extant robe containing these roundels. Now, not actually very much of it is extant. A lot of this has been recreated based on the fragments and based on the known shape of the garments. However, both of these robes were associated with the imperial court, with an emperor. These particular robes are probably of actually local manufacture. Both the Liao and the Xixia, who were the precursors to the Uyghur people now, they had, and in the case of the Uyghurs, have a very strong weaving tradition. However, this idea of the Chinese practice of regulating entitlement and to who can have a robe, granting privileges of wearing robes to others, the Liao picked up on that. And this type of restriction definitely made these types of robes, of course, more desirable. We know human nature is like that. It made it more prestigious, more people wanted one, so they became the subject of demands by the tribute nations, even raids, and even further blackmail. By the early 16th century, China gets kind of fed up and says, okay, no more, nobody's getting any more robes in the north. Well, of course, we know how that goes. If you say you can't have it, it just makes it that much more desirable. So the Manchu in particular found ways of getting around this prohibition and still managed to get robes. Now, just jumping ahead a little bit, after the Jin took over China, eventually the Mongols swept in 1271. They took over not only the Jin territory, the southern Song territory, but as we know, spread all across Asia. So they established what we know as the Yuan dynasty. And the dragon robe was part of their official court wardrobe. And here we see Kublai Khan wearing a dragon embroidered robe with a fabulous, probably ermine coat over top of it. And then this is a later emperor of the Yuan. Now with him, what you can see on the red robe is there's a suggestion of what we call a quatrefoil design. It's a four-lobed design, and in this case, these robes usually had a big dragon that looped all the way around the neckline. The other thing to note about this image is that he's wearing a kind of short-sleeved surcoat over top of his red robe. And this is a style that we'll see again. But this quatrefoil design persisted into the Ming. So eventually the Mongols overextended themselves, and a native Chinese dynasty was able to take control again, the Ming dynasty. The Ming is one of the richest, kind of most fabulous dynasties in China. But in the beginning, they avoided the dragon robe because it was associated with the Yuan, and the Yuan were foreigners, and if you're not Chinese, you're a barbarian, so they didn't want to kind of make that official, but a lot of officials continued to wear it, and why not? I mean, who can argue with it? It's so fabulous. During the late Ming, a federation of groups made up of the Jurchens and Mongols and other people, including Chinese who lived along the northern border there, formed a federation, which became the Manchu Confederation. So the Manchu are not a specific people, they were a conglomeration of a number of groups. Mainly, they sort of trace their ancestry back to the Jurchens, but it did include a lot of other people as well. When a peasant rebellion took over the capital of China, which was Beijing, in 1644, well, the first thing that happened was the emperor hung himself. That was the last emperor of the Ming. But then the general who was coming to try to save the capital realized he couldn't do it by himself and asked the Manchu for help. Now, up to this point, the Manchu and the Chinese had had a difficult relationship because the Manchu were gaining power and the Chinese, didn't like that. So the idea of this general was first that the Manchu would come in and they would restore the Ming dynasty, and then, we'd be very appreciative. And the Manchu said, sure, we'll help, but they had been amassing strength for years, really waiting for an opportunity like that. So indeed, they did come in, they quelled the rebellion, and they stayed. They formed the last dynasty of China, the Qing dynasty. They claimed the mandate of heaven. And let's see what they were wearing in the Ming. Well, again, the Ming, in response to the Yuan, the foreigners, went back to what they considered to be an ancient style robe, again, very voluminous and impressive, lots of silk. These had, flowing sleeves, full skirts, and required nearly 12 meters of silk in each one of these robes. Now, you can imagine this is heavy to be wearing, particularly maybe in the winter when they were heavier weight. So it encumbered their movement. Also, these big sleeves encumbered movement. So it required a slow and stately pace, very dignified kind of standing. The sleeves required two hands to manage them because they would be flopping down. They were long as well as wide or long. And they had also other robes underneath these robes. So really, this clothing was only suitable for very sedentary court life, which, consisted of looking at paintings and practicing calligraphy and, debating points of Confucianism, perhaps. But when we, contrast this with the Yuan, which were garments that were styled for action, and we know that the Mongols, of course, again, were a warrior culture. And again, here with this layout, I hope you can see it, we see how, again, this is loom-shaped garments. Very little waste in cutting out this garment. So making full use of the loom width and, really impressive. So when the Manchu conquered the Ming, they again expanded the empire in about the first, 40 to 100 years. They were consolidating and expanding their territory, even beyond what China is today. You can see some dotted lines there, which is Chinese territory today. Not as far as the Mongols, but a long way out to the west. The Manchu were very smart. They had studied history, and especially looking at the examples of the Mongols and the Jin and the Liao, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. They decided that being assimilated into Chinese culture was at the root of the problem. So they had a great concern to maintain their ethnic identity, their cultural identity. One of the first acts they did was restyle the court robes to, again, going back to a narrow shape, indicative of like the northern nomads wore. And then they also brought in, and now that was restricted to only members of the court. So all civil officials, which were both Manchu and Chinese, had to wear the Manchu-style robe. This was not only to assert authority, but it was also in part to reduce discrimination, so that by looking at an official, you couldn't necessarily tell what his ancestry was, whether he was Chinese or Manchu. However, the other thing the Manchu did was bring in their hairstyle, which was a shaved forehead and a long plait of hair down the back. Up to this point, the Chinese men had worn their hair long, but in a sort of a top knot. And the hairstyle was imposed on all Chinese men. Everybody had to wear it, if you were male. It was hugely unpopular, in part because Confucian doctrine suggests that any kind of damage to your body, alteration to your body, was being disrespectful to your parents. So shaving your head back to the center point was not a popular thing. These were emphatic gestures in hair and clothing, and it visually not only signified the new regime, it also asserted the authority over the minority Chinese population. In doing so, the Manchu acknowledged their stepland origins. They legitimized their claims to rule because they linked back to preceding dynasties, the Mongols and the Jin, which did rule China or parts of China and thus had the mandate of heaven. So here we have another Qing emperor. This is Qianlong, the fourth emperor. He's Yongzhen's son, and again, one of the most brilliant emperors of the Qing dynasty. And here we have a portrait of a Ming official, Wang Ao. This is just to show you a suggested way that the Ming robes had been altered originally to form Qing courtwear. The Manchu rulers continued to use dragon-decorated robes, and they were really trying to establish a program where they transformed the image of the ruler from a barbarian chieftain to a legitimate emperor of China in the eyes of the Chinese. Because they weren't stupid. They knew that they had to get the Chinese population to accept them so that they could actually rule China. So they took this big voluminous robe, and the first thing they did was cut off the bottom so that they could then take in the side seams of the top. Now, it's hard to tell in this image, but the Ming robes had decoration on the lower part of the sleeves. So to narrow the sleeves in accordance with Manchu styles would have cut through the design and it would look terrible. So instead, Shidler Kamen, a scholar who studied this, suggested that they cut off the lower design, used it elsewhere, took in the sleeves, and then added another fabric, which we can see here in this image of a robe where it's just straight yellow. That's actually a separate piece of fabric. That's one explanation. Others have suggested that they were trying to mimic this idea of the short surcoat over the long-sleeved robe that we saw in the image of the Yuan emperor. Whatever, it's the reason. Eventually, by Qianlong's time, this was pretty standard, that there was this section of fabric underneath. Now, the weaving centers were well established in China, so the Qing just continued to make use of that. They didn't want to change that at all. They just adjusted the way that they were going to use the fabric. Back to the Ming for a minute. In the late Ming, there were some experiments with patterning robes in different ways, including these large bold designs of a single dragon or two dragons that took up the entire design field and didn't separate it into design at the chest and design at the hem. These are really fabulous. There's very few of these, or maybe none of these, that survive in their original form. These are all Tibetan robes that have been remade from late Ming Dynasty robes. And so we sometimes see other fabrics pieced in, or even using a hanging. This is probably some kind of wall hanging rather than an actual robe, this earliest one. So this is kind of where the design was when the Manchu came to power, this big, impressive dragon. Now we have to think about, because these robes did take years, whether they were embroidered or woven in tapestry to make, that designs didn't change very quickly, obviously. If you've invested that much time and you're in the middle of making one, you can't readily change. But what did start to change was this border at the bottom of indicating sort of billows or swelling water, along with some mountain-like forms that did start to come in, with the rest of the field devoted to sky, essentially. So as we've seen, or maybe we haven't seen yet, Manchu garments evolved from simple utilitarian garments that were made for protection, warmth, hunting, and became really sophisticated garments that spoke to ethnic identity and also domination of not just China, but the universe. John Vollmer, another textile scholar, has done an analysis of historic garments of northern peoples, northeastern peoples in this part of the world. And he feels that in contrast to the loom-shaped garment, there's this other tradition which is hide-shaped garments. And he shows this example of how the shape of a Manchu robe or a northern nomad's robe is really more like a hide than it is a loom. And definitely, historically there were people who did make coats out of hide with the fur still attached, wore it kind of over top of a double-sided apron sort of affair, and then also tight sleeves, tightly fastened with toggles, belted, worn with boots, trousers. This conserves heat in the winter, protects from insects in the summer, and this characteristic cuff that we see on the Manchu robe. The sleeves tended to be quite long, so that they could be pulled down with the cuff over the hand, which, if you think about horse riding, in the absence of gloves, protects your hands pretty well. And these were retained as part of traditional Manchu clothing. So this style persisted even when they began to use fabric. Also very popular by this point, which is 17th century, is 4 dragons radiating from the neck. And here we have the addition of many small dragons also floating around. So now what we've done, taken that big dragon and shrunk it, but we still have lots of dragons. And when we think about that these robes were worn belted, think about it. If you've got this fabulous dragon down your front, you put a belt on, it's going to chop it right in half. So the thinking is that the dragon got compressed into the top half so that when there was a belt, you wouldn't destroy that fabulous design. It's hard to confirm that this is emperor's robe. It's felt that this was probably made for Emperor Kangxi. While only the emperor could wear yellow, he could also wear any other color he really wanted. And blue was very popular amongst the Manchu. This is an incredibly fine example of a tapestry woven loom. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with this technique, I threw in this little diagram so you could get a sense of it. Instead of just weaving a piece of fabric, not just, but weaving a piece of fabric and then embroidering the surface, or maybe making it in brocade, which is again an edge-to-edge kind of process. In kusa, or tapestry, each area of color has its own little section of weaving. So you have many, many, many little bobbins, little sections of weaving that go across the width of the fabric. Now, I think with this, you can get a real sense that this was not a fast process, and only the highest, most wealthy, most important people could possibly have this kind of robe. This one is also tapestry woven. Now, this is mid-19th century, but in the mid-18th century, the design of the dragons became more consolidated. So now we have 3 more or less equally sized dragon, one on the chest, one on either flank. There's also 2 on the shoulders, and then the same 3 on the back. Now that adds up to 8. There's actually another dragon on the robe, and we'll get to him in a bit. But also now we see the robe is made with multiple fabrics in the sleeve extensions, the collar, the cuffs. So this separation of the dragons to account for the belt, some people say that's a concession to Chinese taste. I think it's just a concession to good design, that it was a shame to break up the dragon that way. By now we have a very elaborate, densely patterned design field. There always had been clouds because it was the sky, but now there's clouds and bats and other things, including these 12 symbols, and we'll talk about those in a minute. At the same time, the bottom border has become wider, so we're getting more water, more billowing waves, more spray. Here again is a blue robe, and as I mentioned, the emperor could wear whatever he wanted, but also the color of the robe was color-coded to the ceremony. So for the ceremony of the winter solstice, the emperor wore blue. That was the color of the winter solstice. Red was the color for the summer solstice. And then, for instance, for the sacrifice to the moon, he wore pale blue. The default color was yellow, but here we see a very handsome blue robe. Now, I've just mentioned the sacrifice at the Temple of Heaven in the winter, so I thought I'd just put in a picture of the Temple of Heaven for you. It's actually a whole complex. So there's this 3-tiered mound at one end, and then way down at the other end is this building, which is the hall of prayer for good harvest. Often that building is called the Temple of Heaven, but in fact the whole complex is the Temple of Heaven, and different kinds of rituals took place there at different times of the year. But at the winter solstice, it took place on the mound. Now, Beijing is cold in the winter, so here we have a blue court robe, a chaofu, lined with sable, and winter robes. Well, if you were wealthy, you could have a fur-lined robe. Otherwise, you had to make do with cotton wadding and multiple linings and so forth. One interesting thing about this robe is it's dated fairly early, but I think we can see it's pretty obviously been remade from a semi-formal robe. This is not a typical arrangement of the dragons on a court robe. So it's that's just an aside. It's just kind of an interesting, question. It probably was a high official rather than the emperor himself, because it would have been important for the emperor to have the proper or kind of iconographic robe. Now, under Emperor Qianlong, whose picture we just saw a bit ago, he was very concerned with preserving Manchu style. He sort of didn't like the loosey-goosey approach to dragons wherever you wanted and however many you wanted. So in 1750, he commissioned a huge monumental review of every regulation that had been promulgated in the Qing dynasty up to that point, which was about 100 years. And whether or not it's a Chinese or Manchu, the Chinese bureaucracy really liked regulations and writing. So it was a lot to go through. It took them 10 years to really kind of decide, based on what had gone before, how they were going to approach this. So this review covered not just garments. There was a big section devoted to the dress, but also ceremonial vessels, musical instruments, regalia, military uniforms, military weaponry, insignia, and so forth. The main part of it was completed about 1759, and really after that, there were very few changes in the basic design of the dragon robe, these 3 dragons positioned equidistant. The costume portion documented not only the emperor's wear for all the different occasions he had to deal with, but all of the civil bureaucracy, right down to the lowest level. And then there was a whole section devoted to women, from the Empress Dowager all the way down through all the wives of the civil officials. So as many as 27 painters and calligraphers had to collaborate to produce the actual document, the illustrated regulations. And it was about 1,300 leaves of text and illustrations. Eventually, 7 copies were made, and they were distributed around the empire to make sure that everybody stuck to the program. I mentioned the 12 symbols of authority a little bit ago. Here we have an example of this from a Ming robe, but these are really much, much earlier. Probably again from the Western Zhou, 11th to the 8th century BC. After 1759, after the big review, Emperor Qianlong decided to bring these 12 symbols onto the robe of the emperor. Now, they'd kind of avoided it up to that point. It was associated with Chinese history, but after 100 years of peace and prosperity in the empire, I think he figured he could risk it. So at that point, these 12 symbols were added to the emperor's robe, and only the emperor's robe. These symbols had distinct meanings. They were considered to increase the wearer's power, access to the spirit world, sort of the sources of wisdom and power, and also, I think, were just more identification for heaven to know who was in charge. Altogether, they really represent the emperor's power as the ruler of the universe. Now, here they're running down either side of the roundels. At the top there is a robe that was excavated from the tomb of the Wangli emperor, Ming emperor, and then they recreated it, which apparently took them about 3 years between the weaving and the embroidery. By reclaiming these 12 symbols of authority, or claiming them as his own, Qianlong was really reiterating the Qing's mandate of heaven, and also that they had embraced the traditional role of a Confucian ruler in China, which was very important for their longevity. And it was one of the longest dynasties in China, and this was in large part due to policies of accommodation to and adaptation of Chinese principles. So here's a 12 symbol robe of the late 18th century, mid 18th century. But before we get to the 12 symbols, let's just analyze the basic layout of the robe. We have the lower border, which is a Li Shui border, the universal ocean that surrounds the earth. Above that, we have a cloud-filled sky, where the dragons are. Between the sky and the water, we have 4 prism-shaped rocks. They're at the cardinal points of the robe. And then the neck opening there is called the Gate of Heaven, which is considered to be the highest point in the universe, with the head of the emperor as the higher order of the universe, of the invisible heavens beyond. So this is a symbolic landscape, essentially. Sky, rocks or earth, water, dragons is representing all the birds and the beasts in it. And here we see it's all that the emperor rules, controls, as the regent of heaven. But the symbolism of this robe was complete only when the emperor had it on. At that point, he became the cosmic axis around which everything revolved, and that connection between heaven and earth. So the layout of these 12 symbols, again, aligns with cardinal directions, seasonal meaning, and so forth. The symbols around the neck, which is the sun, moon, constellation, and the mountain, these refer to the sacrifices that the emperor had to make to celestial and terrestrial forces. The 3 sun, moon, constellation refer to the heavens, the mountain as the earth. Around the waist, we have the Fu, the axe, the pair of dragons, and the flowery creature, who's also a pheasant. These refer to the solstices and the equinoxes with, or should we start? Well, let's start with the flowery creature. The pheasant refers to a constellation that appears in China in the spring called the Red Bird. The dragons, sorry, I have to refer to this. Dragons is high summer, and also yin yang, that kind of meaning, and the beasts. The axe refers to the autumnal equinox, and also the emperor's power over life and death. Autumn was the traditional time for executions to take place. And then the Fu symbol, which is kind of esoteric, it is the winter solstice and refers to the emperor as the supreme magistrate, the chief judge of everything. Then when we drop to knee level, where we have the water weed, the libation cups, flames, and grain, these refer to 4 of the 5 elemental forces in Chinese thought. So grain standing for wood, or also plant life, and also the emperor's responsibility to feed his people. The water weed for water, purity. The libation cups are also temple cups. They're made out of metal, so they refer to metal and also filial piety, because you're offering sacrifices in the temple. And then flame, obviously, is fire, which refers to intellectual brilliance. There's one more, which is earth, and that we go back to the neck ring where the mountain is, because earth is the center direction, and also the emperor is the center, and also the color of earth is yellow. So there's this whole program of symbols here that really speak to the power of the emperor. Now, we can just note here the layout of the dragons, front and back, 3 on the back, 3 on the front, 2 on each sleeve. This has a further relationship to an idealized farming arrangement called the Jingtian, the wellhead system, with the idea that, well, actually the character Jing looks like the supports around a well, but it also translates into 9 squares. At the center in this system of farming is the land that belongs to the landlord or the lord. And around it are 8 fields, which belong to other farmers or are farmed by other farmers for their own use. And then all the farmers cooperatively farm the center section on behalf of the landlord. So this 9 squares is echoed in the arrangement of the dragons. So the 8 fields surround the 9th and protect it. These 4, the closest, occupy the cardinal points of the compass. They establish this orderly balance and are, in a case of the farming community, are the first line of defense, or, well, really the second line of defense, the closest line of defense to essentially the emperor, let's put it that way. And then the fields on the corners are your second line of defense. So these are where, I guess it would actually be the first line of defense, whatever. They're where we're going to protect first before you get into the center section. So 9 as a number has special significance and is associated with the emperor. And here's the 9th dragon. Now 9 is the highest single-digit number. It's 3 times 3 prime, the product of 2 prime numbers, so is just considered very auspicious. The 9th dragon here hides under the overlap. Some people say that, oh, it's to protect the wearer that much further. I think it was just a concession to both the symbolism of 9 as being important, and they didn't want to mess up this lovely symmetrical design they had. But there's the 9th dragon, and this is another winter robe, fabulously lined in leopard fur. But it gives you a sense of the overall program. So as we've seen, I've just introduced to you some of the cultural and political issues that underlie this fabulous garment, the emperor's robe. I hope that this has piqued your interest in Chinese art and Chinese history, especially Chinese textiles. Now, you might be interested to know that next fall of 2014, the Vancouver Art Gallery is bringing in an exhibition called, I don't actually remember what it's called, but it's Objects from the Forbidden City. So with that, I'm sure there will be dragon robes as part of it. You'll be able to understand them a little better. And now it's the shameless self-promotion part of the lecture, wherein, as Holly mentioned, from May to June, I'll be teaching a course called Fabric of the Empire, How Silk Defined China. So we'll really be looking at silk's importance to China's culture, economy, politics, all of those things. It's good for men too. Lots of blood and guts as part of that. But anyway, I hope to see you there maybe, and thank you for coming today. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much.